Hi, everybody. Before we get started, we recorded this interview on April 1st, and unfortunately we had some lag issues with the telephone communication, so I've tried to correct that as best as possible. I do apologize if some of my reactions to what Mike says is a little delayed. So with that being said, enjoy the show. Welcome back to the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. Now, if you didn't hear the first part of our interview with Michael Katz, I highly recommend it. You'll get to travel through time as the invention of the electronic game at Mattel takes form, the move to Coleco with revolutionarily competitive advertising and the launch of the ColecoVision, and then his move to Epyx, where he took a relatively small RPG maker and turned it into a powerhouse of the Commodore 64 scene. And that is where we're going to be picking up today in our second part of the Michael Katz interview. And welcome back to the show, Michael Katz.
Thank you, Carl.
Now, last time we were talking and we had gotten up to the point where you basically revitalized the product line at Epyx. You had brought in some licenses, you did the standardization of the packages, and you brought in this concept of the action strategy game, where every game was actiony, but it still had to have a strategy element. Now, a couple of things happen also at Epyx while you're there. One of them is that Epyx starts to distribute Lucasfilm's games. Can you tell me a little bit about how that came about?
Yes, I can. As I recall, the person at Lucas who contacted us, who had a history in the game and entertainment industry, is named and was named Steve Arnold, A-R-N-O-L-D. And I believe Steve Arnold was in charge of the game development at Lucas. And Lucas hired and or used some of their motion picture development people to create several games on the PC. They needed a publisher to publish the games, to do the marketing, the advertising, the promoting, a company that was small, local, could work well with Lucas, which was also near San Francisco, but mainly a company that was dynamic and had inroads at the key retailers and whose marketing and personnel they respected. So Steve Arnold, I think, approached us. We did not approach them, and asked if Epyx would be interested in licensing 3 games, and I'm not sure I remember the names of all 3 games. Ball Blazer was one. Help me, Carl.
The Eidolon was one. And I believe
Rescue on
Cronus Rift.
That one of the.
Rescue on Fractalus was also
probably
one,
either 3 or 4 games. I remember Eidolon, Ball Blazer, Rescue on Fractalus, and so Lucas had never been in the game business, either the traditional classic game business or the video game business or computer game business. So they came and presented prototypes, I think, or partially developed versions of several of those games to us at Epyx. And Bob Botch, who was my marketing director, and I, and were impressed that we had been selected and flattered. And as far as what we thought of the games versus what was making computer games for the mass market successful and popular in those days was dramatically different from the tact of the Lucas games. They were artistically extremely interesting, visually very interesting, but in terms of storyline, gameplay, basic knowledge and understanding of why a teenager or a computer gamer would play a game and what kind of gratification they wanted to get, they were very ephemeral, if I can use the word, and intellectual. So we agreed to do the packaging, do the marketing, do the promotion, do the manufacturing, be the publisher, and pay a licensing fee to Lucas for the privilege of doing that. So we did it. We tried to get support from retailers and consumers behind the games, and we didn't have a lot of success because I just, don't feel that the people at Lucas understood or could get their designers and developers to put into the elements of the game the play features that make a game and make a game successful.
I can understand that. Those games were technologically very, very advanced. I mean, they're using fractal graphics and stuff, but I can imagine that at the time it probably went over a few people's heads.
I don't want to be rude, but we were quite surprised when they were presented to us, and we smiled and gave the appropriate politically correct compliments, but it was surprising to the game designers at Epix and the marketing people and everyone else that Lucas, the great Lucas of Star Wars fame and other wonderful films and genres and series, did not put into the development of the game the elements that were going to make it popular and successful with the current market for computer games at the time.
So when you guys when that license that you had paid for that first batch of games ran out, did you have an option to extend it, or were you no longer at the company by that point?
To tell you the truth, since I probably wouldn't have remembered if I hadn't been asked by you that we had a partnership, I guess we had agreed maybe with them to pull the products, period, after year one, because they just weren't being accepted by the retailers and the consumers, or it was put on the back burner, and we still had the rights, or they would. I don't know the answer to your question. I don't remember how it was dissolved. There was nothing unpleasant about the relationship. It was a good relationship from a personnel and interpersonal standpoint, but I don't remember how the decision, if there was a formal decision made between us and Lucas, or both of us together and the world at large, that they just, didn't want to continue the effort. I forget whether I guess they had Star Wars games after that. So the license to the Star Wars games much later, were handled completely differently, and there were different relationships. So I'm sorry, I don't remember whether we just closed down and then put the games into storage, or whether Luke just made other plans or tried to do something else. I don't think they did.
Yeah. No. I think they did get distribution through, I believe, EA's distribution arm a few years later, but what they did in the meantime, I honestly wouldn't be able to tell you either. Okay, now there's one other little thing that did come up at Epix. Now that was the in the Commodore 64 circles, very famous Epix Fast Load cartridge, which I believe came to you guys through. I can't believe I'm blanking on the name of the company that you acquired, the one that also had the Summer Games prototype.
Bob Brown's company.
Starpath.
That was popular. We did offer that. We did sell that as an accessory through the normal retail channels, and I guess we, milked it for all it was worth, and kept it in the product line as long as it was practical and reasonable. But it did accelerate, if I'm not mistaken, and you mentioned that it did, so correct me if I'm wrong, it did accelerate the download time considerably on a lot of the games that were higher memory games, but without it would take up to an hour, as I recall, to load a game before you could play it.
Yeah, it wasn't quite an hour, but yeah, it definitely helped. It was a huge, huge one. Now, I was wondering from a standpoint of a company like Epix, which at that point had been a software-only business, how difficult was it to get into that very limited manufacturing niche?
Are you referring to the manufacturing of the cartridge?
Of the cartridge.
I don't remember how or where it was manufactured. We probably had a custom manufacturer in the Orient. I think we probably did. I don't remember the name of the one that was very popular and that a lot of the game companies were using, as opposed to having their own cartridge. Ramux, does that sound familiar?
Yeah, that's.
Okay.
I couldn't tell you one
there
way
was
or the
a
other,
company that did a lot of contract manufacturing of cartridges, and I think we probably used them or someone like them to make it.
Gotcha. Okay. Now, so that kind of wraps up. I mean, you're at Epix for a relatively short period of time, but it covered a lot of classic games and really a very specific period of time in Epix's history. Now, in '85, if I'm not mistaken, you leave Epix, correct? Yeah. Now, why did you make that decision?
There were two reasons, but the main reason was I wasn't in love with being with a company that made just or primarily software. I like hardware. I like new products. And as we said in my last interview, what turns me on and turned me on then were the jobs I had at various companies and ad agencies working on a range of new products. So to be with a company that was only making computer software on disk or in some cases cartridge, but mostly disk, was not creating innovative new product, which is what I loved to do, what I wanted to do, what I thought there was a market for. And so after my first year at Epix, I kept rallying the board without success to get out of the cartridge-only business and to look into doing innovative new hardware, electronic toy and game hardware, like the kinds of things that Worlds of Wonder, Don Kingsborough's company, had done with laser tag and with Teddy Ruxpin, basically bring electronics to the whole world of toys and games, and not just, be a company making disk-based computer games. So the board was not willing to do that because of the investment required to get into hardware, because of the difficulty of making new hardware successful, which actually was no more difficult than making a game successful. They were both challenging. But I wanted Epix to be a broad-based electronic toy and game company, not just a computer software or computer game company. So when the board was not willing to let me do that, I decided that, I wanted to be at a place where I could do that, or that had a much broader product line, which was what I was used to in all my previous experiences. So that was the basis of my interest.
Gotcha.
I knew Jack Trammell and Sam, and I don't believe I knew the other brothers at the time, but I knew Jack and Sam, and especially Jack, because having been in the computer software business and having been in that industry, I just had met Jack a few times socially, and I got a phone call from Jack asking if I would have lunch with Jack and Sam, and I suspected that, there was some opportunity that was going to be discussed or presented. I didn't remember at the time whether it was personal in my mind or involving Epix, but I went to lunch, and at lunch they outlined that they wanted to bring back the video game category at Atari to finish the introduction of the 7800, which had been started before Atari was sold to them, reconstruct and have live again the 2600 and develop software for that. And they wanted me to be involved with sales and marketing on the computer side, getting ready for the development of a new computer, the ST computer, which was going to be Jack's answer 4 or 5 years after he had introduced the Commodore 64. He wanted to develop basically a new low-end, popular-priced computer with much higher power and more capability, and do it under the Atari name. So he wanted me to run the video game division, because he was not particularly interested in video games, nor was his son or sons at the time, and to be a sales and marketing guy, because he knew functionally that was my interest and experience on the computer side. And so I listened to the offer, and I said, on one other condition, I would be interested. And I said that other condition is Atari would be a wonderful company to have a electronic toy and game division. And I gave Worlds of Wonder as an example. Worlds of Wonder had gone out of business because while they had two great products, Laser Tag and Teddy Ruxpin, the company spent an awful lot of money and was not profitable, and basically went down the tubes because of poor fiscal management. So my pitch to Jack and Sam was Atari would be a great name and franchise to start a new division, Entertainment Electronics. That was my suggestion for the name, Entertainment Electronics, that would be much broader than just games, and whether the games were, portable, handheld, desktop, whatever, but start a new division and do electronic toy and game product. So my job in that case would have been, or jobs would have been threefold, helping bring back the video game division, running that, being the head of sales and marketing for the computer division, and being president of the entertainment electronics division, a new division where we would develop internally or through outside inventors, which I guess was my pitch, because I'm sure Jack didn't want to devote a lot of time to have his designers and engineers within Atari work on electronic toys and games or entertainment electronics. So my pitch was, let other companies, if we're doing conversions, other companies that have a capability, maybe some of the arcade companies, and also certainly the top independent game and toy designers like Marvin Glass in Chicago, Eddie Goldfarb in Los Angeles, let them work on the development of entertainment electronic or electronic toy and game products, and those products would be considered for the new division to make up the basis of the products in the new division. So they said yes at the same lunch. I asked for stock and got a nice stock option agreement with them and a good salary. I got the title of president for 2 of the 3 functions that they wanted me to have, the video game division and the entertainment electronics division. So that was sort of a dream come true, and being able to construct to an extent my job and to have it include areas that I was very interested in getting into or having Atari get into. So that's how it happened.
Okay. Now, and as somebody who grew up on the Commodore 64, the legend of Jack Tramiel always is something that was always in the background when you'd read articles about the machine or his original company as well as the Atari company. This going a little bit away from business, but what was he like as a person when you were doing business with him, when you were working?
Well, most people ask me that from the outside, whether they're in the industry or in journalism or whatever. I always perceive that they're picturing what I like to tell them to satisfy their imagination, and that is a Khrushchev-like character who is pounding on a conference table with his shoe to get the attention and authoritarianism projected that is the authoritarian figure of the company. So Jack at times was dogmatic, he was forceful, he was rude, he was sort of a bully, and he was that kind of a character. But, he was lovable in a lot of ways. I respected him because he questioned every basic business tenet that ever existed in business. He questioned why things had to be made or done in a particular way, and he questioned the prices that were being charged by suppliers, whether they were ad agencies, PR firms, manufacturing facilities. So everything was looked at basically from as though it had never been done before, and he wanted his managers to be the same curious, questioning, budget-conscious, smart, tight business people, male or female, that he was, and he wanted to be himself. So for about 6 months, we fought about things often, especially it was on the computer side that might have had to do with sales and marketing. He didn't know as much about the video game business, so the arguments didn't last as long there. But after about 6 months, I recall, we got together in his office, and he said, "I'm tired of fighting with you. Why don't I hire someone to take over sales and marketing on the computer side? You don't like computers. You don't know computers. And you just continue to bring back the video games and fool around a little with your entertainment electronics." So we agreed to disagree in a politically practical way, and that that was that. The retailers didn't trust, and in a lot of cases didn't like Jack. Developers didn't trust and didn't like, in a lot of cases, Jack, because at times Jack had, in their minds, gone back on commitments or agreements for either royalties or advertising that was supposed to be behind the products, advertising and promotion funded and supported by Atari. And the retailers were used to having their key manufacturers kick in a lot of money for cooperative advertising to offset the price of the retailers' advertising in newspapers and supplements of newspapers and magazines and all that. So Jack was not willing to play ball in the traditional way that a lot of things were done between retailers and manufacturers in the business world. So that's part of how he established a reputation and was known as someone tough who wasn't, compromising and who was difficult to deal with and, always wanted to get something for nothing or something for less. And there's something to be said for that kind of management, but, there's also a way to do it in a different way than, some people's personalities permit them to do it. So I ended up liking Jack a lot, respecting him, liking Sam. One of the sons was in development, and why am I forgetting his name? Gary, who had been a stockbroker, was involved in sales on the computer side and business development, and had a business on the side, which was a garage that was fixing and selling Ferrari cars. And that was his first love. And so that was Gary. He was the youngest of the brothers or sons, and Sam was the older. Sam became president of the company when Jack moved up to chairman. And I forget the name of the engineer brother who worked at Atari in engineering and software hardware development.
Yeah, trying to think of his name too, and I'm blanking on it right now.
Anyhow, so that answers your question about working with Jack and Sam.
Definitely. Now, those first 6 months when you were also dealing with the marketing for the computer division, was the Atari ST already completely designed when you came on board, or was it still in that development process?
And as the product progressed and when it was ready for introduction, the problem became getting the right kind of full distribution in electronic stores, in computer stores, in mass merchants for the ST computer. And the problem became one in which the retailers didn't have as much enthusiasm for the product as Atari and Jack had himself. And also Jack and Atari were not offering the kind of introductory promotional support that I just referred to, where a lot of money was going to be thrown behind the product by Atari, and a lot of support given to the retailers to promote the product. Another problem was software support. The programmers, independent programmers and developers in the computer world spent their time and money to develop new software with the goal of getting a lot of royalty payments from the company that they supplied the software to, or for selling a lot of software independently or through other publishers, and having the buyer of the hardware basically, contribute to their revenues for having the software. The problem was that, once again, creating awareness and trial for the new hardware was key to any developer who had their choice of developing software for Apple or IBM systems or Commodore systems or whatever the systems were, Texas Instruments, whoever, HP, whoever. So the developers had to be encouraged to support new systems, and they wanted to support the system because that's how they were spending their time and money of their development groups for months and in some cases years. They wanted to know that the installed base would be big enough when their software was ready to ship so that they would make a lot of money on the sale of their software or on the royalties they would collect from the software. And they never felt that way about the ST. So the ST was looking for widespread distribution in the U.S., couldn't get it, and it wasn't getting as much developer support as was needed to really create a good library of software. I understand, because I didn't remember, that it was much more successful in Europe, and it was better received in Europe, but it was not in the U.S. And what that led Jack Tramiel and Atari to was actually buying almost bankrupt national, I think it was national, at least very strong regional electronics retailer. So like the Tandy model and Radio Shack, Jack said, if those damn retailers aren't going to support me, I'm going to buy my own chain of retail stores. The hell with them. And just like Tandy, I'm going to, have my own Radio Shack, and I'll sell my product strictly through my own stores. So Atari bought Federated Electronics, a bankrupt chain of electronic stores headquartered in Southern California, mostly in the western part of the U.S., with the hope that that could become the Radio Shack that Tandy had. And nobody at Atari, nobody hired by Atari, knew anything about managing a retail chain, and didn't recognize that while the price was attractive to obtain Federated, there were all kinds of other problems, debts, issues with Federated that were not going to be magical just because Atari had bought them out of bankruptcy. So Federated was an unsuccessful chain, as it turned out. The ST didn't get the kind of distribution and support that was needed to make it like the Commodore 64 years previously, and that was the end of that. The mission of the video game division was to sell as much video game hardware and software. We lowered the price of the 2600 to under $50 to make it the low price spread, basically, for anyone who could not afford to spend $199 for the latest Nintendo or Atari or Mattel type machine with software that was $39 or $49. They could buy, even though the graphics were not as good, they could buy a 2600 for under $50 and software for under $15. So we developed a commercial. There was a jingle, and the jingle was, memorable, and the lyrics had under $50 and talked about this being the option to anybody who couldn't afford to spend 4 times as much to get one of the higher powered systems with a more expensive hardware. So Atari supplied funding from the profits we made in the video game division, supplied funding to support the development of the ST. That was Jack's motivation, basically. He wasn't really that interested in getting, a very successful video game division going again. We had to scrounge to get licenses for the 7800 because it only had about 7 titles when Jack bought Atari. And so we finished the development of the 7800 in terms of the hardware. And my mission was to, get more software. And since awareness is important and we could not get arcade titles because Nintendo had a lock on all the best titles, and even if they didn't, I doubt I could have gotten Jack's approval to pay the kind of advances and guarantees the arcade companies wanted. So the mission then was, where do you get games that have some awareness that are going to be perceived as being perhaps a good purchase for anyone who wanted to pay $79 to buy an Atari 7800 system rather than the 2600. And so we came up with the idea that I thought was pretty smart at the time, because the computer game category had just been a popular category, which I was in at Epix, and there were well-known titles in the computer game category from 5 or 6 top companies. I said, what if I go back to my buddies who run those companies, whether it was Spectrum Holobyte or Microprose or Accolade or Data East, and what if I try to get some of their hot titles licensed for the 7800, and we would do the conversions. We would have a baseball game like Hardball, which was the best computer baseball game at the time, being done by Alan Miller at Accolade. And what if we get hot genres with hot titles, and the awareness building will come from the computer game generation and genre, knowing those games by the particular title that we would be offering on the 7800. So that's what we did. We made our own commercials. We wrote our own commercials. We had them produced. We used media at weird hours during the 24-hour cycle so we could get good buys on secondary stations to do some awareness creating of the 2600 and the 7800. So that was that basically. And the Entertainment Electronics Division had a very exciting start, which unfortunately also turned out to be the finish, because the people at Williams Electronics, who I knew from the them having very good arcade games and titles. And I met them first at Coleco when we started licensing some of the arcade titles from a guy named Ken Podesna, who ran their development at Williams. He had a team of smart engineers who on their own developed a product that was presented to us at my request because I was looking for product for the new entertainment electronics division, and they had done a updated laser tag product that was 5 years removed or newer than the one done by Worlds of Wonder, and really very good technically. And they didn't want to market the product and manufacture the product themselves, so they asked if we wanted to license it, and that would become the first product for the new entertainment electronics division. I got excited. Everyone in marketing got excited. A lot of people in design got excited. And this was about 6 months before Christmas in, I guess it was like 1987. And we were about to present the product to key retailers. We had made an agreement with Williams, and they completed the development of the product. And Jack called me into his office at one point. Maybe it was when we were supposed to come up with one of the payments of advances to Williams as part of the deal. And Jack said, I've decided I don't want to do this product. I don't want to do this division. And so I had to call up my buddies at Williams and tell them the deal was off, even though it was a signed deal. The deal was off, and it was about September or October, and we had promised a Christmas introduction. Oh. The deal was off. We were pulling out, and of course that meant that they had lost that Christmas if they wanted to do it themselves or if they wanted to find a marketing and manufacturing partner. So that was not very endearing for us at Atari or me, but some people might have said, hell, that's, quote, typical, unquote, Jack Trammell. So that was disappointing, and that was my ill-fated entertainment electronics division, because that, of course, became an indication that Jack was not going to support financially that division, which would need, plenty of support to build product, acquire product, promote and market product. So that was one of the two sad stories involving new product opportunities at Atari in my division. The other one, I don't know if I've told you about it or whether you've heard about it, but I was friendly with the chairman in the United States of Sega, and why am I blanking on his name right now? Well, anyhow, we were friends. He lived in Los Angeles. He was an investor, private investor, as well as being a very knowledgeable guy in terms of arcade games and pachinko games and everything like that. Is it pachinko or kachinko? Yeah, and why am I forgetting his name? Well, he was the co-chairman of Sega, and he was in charge of the U.S. And Sega had a very brief history in the U.S., and so there had been some Sega presence in the U.S., but not a real Sega U.S. division. But I was approached by, we'll think of his name in a minute. I was approached by the chairman in the U.S. of Sega and asked whether there would be any interest at Atari in taking over, basically licensing from Sega, a 16-bit game system that they had just developed in Japan and had developed some software for, but which they saw as the superior system to Nintendo and Atari and any 8-bit system. And, of course, that was fascinating to me and others because that meant Atari could make a real comeback in a new generation of video game systems and could be the first into the 16-bit home system realm with a system that was already developed in terms of hardware and was, in terms of animation and graphics and sound and everything, superior and impressive compared to what was out there right now from Nintendo. So we had a meeting in the offices at Atari, and Jack and Sam, of course, were in the meeting, and everyone, I thought, got excited about the concept of Atari becoming a prominent or the prominent player in video games again, and not having to create the hardware, because there it was, just do a licensing deal with Sega. So everyone left the meeting, and everyone was delighted. There was a handshake. There was an agreement. What had to be worked out with the details of the advance and the guarantee, and what Sega was asking for, what they could live with, what Atari could live with. And to make a long story short, after loving the product, saying that we wanted the product, Jack was not willing to pay the advance and the guarantee that Sega was looking for. And so the Sega Genesis, or what became the Sega Genesis, walked out the door of Atari and became the basis of a new Sega division, U.S. Sega, and, which I joined several months later, and that could have been the comeback product for Atari, but the philosophy of Jack Tramiel prevented that from happening.
Oh, that's terrible. Now, got to go back a minute because there was a lot of information just there. So the LaserDAC product, did Williams ever launch anything like that or sell it on to anybody else?
No, not that I know of. It was too late to do for that Christmas, and I don't know if they pursued Mattel or Hasbro or any of the other toy companies. So I don't know the answer to that, but it's a very good question. They did not offer it themselves, and as I recall. They could have also gone to VTech. They could have gone to Codemaster and a lot of other places, but I don't know that they did or didn't.
You mentioned several times that the retailers were reluctant to work with Jack. How did that manifest itself? Since you were in charge of the marketing of some of these products, was it outright hostility? Was it just not answering phone calls? What was the reality on the ground of those conversations?
Since there was experience with the 2600, and it was the first, very, very successful home video game system, the retailers knew the 2600, knew it could sell, and the idea that it was being repositioned as the low price spread and would give the retailers a $49.99 price point video game system with inexpensive software, that was enough. That was enough to get the interest and get distribution on the 2600. That gave the retailers a price point at the low end, and they had Nintendo, and I forget whether Intellivision was still there or ColecoVision, but they had Nintendo at the high end. So that wasn't an issue. If we had come in, which we did as a matter of fact, I left something out of the story, Jack felt that he could attack the high end of the the video game market at the same time that he attacked the low end of the computer market by coming out with a 32-bit perhaps console that was positioned as the most powerful video game system and the least expensive home computer system, all built into one. So we experimented and tested a product called the XE system, the XE computer, which was positioned by us as the most sophisticated, inexpensive game system and the most powerful, popular priced computer, all built into one. In other words, you want an inexpensive computer and you want a good game system. You don't have to go out and buy an individual computer. You don't have to go out and buy an individual game system. Let's tell people in promotion and advertising that you could get both in one product. So that was Jack's concept. Not that bad a concept, but as it turned out, because we didn't do a lot of research, but as it turned out, when we did do the research, there was a credibility problem. Nobody believed that you could have the best game-playing product and the lowest priced, good, popular computer in one product. They didn't think the product would deliver on both promises. And, of course, they didn't think there'd be software there to support either side of the positioning. And they were right on both counts because it wasn't a good idea, because there wasn't credibility that one product could be the best of both. And we weren't going to get support, once again, the Atari and Jack Tramiel problem. We weren't going to get support from developers, game developers, or other types of software, because they weren't going to put in the work and the time to develop at their expense software to play on yet another product from Jack Tramiel that wasn't going to get the millions of dollars of advertising and promotional support to create awareness and stimulate trial and get a good franchise and market for the product. So it suffered some of the things that the ST computer suffered in terms of, believability, credibility, and developer support. So
now, was that the same XE product that did get launched? I don't know if that was, I think it's 88. The XE does get launched, but it was just the Atari 8-bit computer line spec down into a console, right? Is that the same one, or was there a different hardware base that was being developed for it at some point?
We might have just taken one of the old Atari computers, like 800 or whatever it was, and used the innards of that and put that into what we called a dual product that could do both and appeal to both audiences. I don't really remember whether we went out and tried to get, whether we introduced the product to retailers and consumers while I was still there. I don't remember, but I think we probably made some presentations.
It did come out. I actually remember seeing it in stores, but I think it came out briefly in the U.S. It didn't last long. Had a little bit more of a life overseas.
Okay, I apologize for not remembering, but that's the history of it.
No. Yeah, and so was there any other attempt while you were at Atari to develop any new hardware? I mean, the 7800 was something that was fairly finished by the time Jack takes the company over, but was there any attempt to really do like a proper 16-bit console or anything like that? Or was that outside the budgetary constraints?
There was no attempt to do what the Genesis, if we had acquired it from Sega, would have given us. So there was no development work on a more powerful game system. No. Jack had all the developers internally, engineering, design, working on the ST computer, and he wanted to put all the money behind the ST computer. Basically, the video game division, as I learned slowly but eventually, what was a bank that was generating cash, and the sole purpose in Jack's mind was to have that division and that cash go into the ST computer, so Atari could once again become a popular priced beginning computer and more advanced computer company, like he had done with whatever Gould's name, his partner at Commodore, when they came out with the Commodore 64.
Gotcha. And, well, the big competition to the Atari ST, or perceived competition at the time, was the Commodore Amiga, and Jack did launch some salvos their way in the form of lawsuits and so forth. Did you were you aware of any of that going on during?
I don't remember, because sometimes I have a mental block against anything computer related involving Atari, because I was busy, at some point with the entertainment electronics effort, short-lived, but very busy. We had a staff of only about six people in the whole games division at Atari when I was there. And when Jack would complain, if he complained at all, about bonuses or paying, the people in my division, or the amount of work we were doing, I would direct his attention to how many sales were being generated per person by dividing 6 people into the several $100 million of sales that we were getting out of video game revenue. And telling him he should be happy because of the sales per employee compared to any other company we were competing with, and certainly compared to the computer division of Atari.
Oh yeah, definitely. We've already talked about you leaving Atari to go over to Sega, and you're touching on with the Genesis and the suggestion that Atari might have gotten that licensing. Just out of curiosity, and you don't have to answer this if you can't, but what were the numbers Sega was looking at? I mean, what kind of deal was Sega actually proposing? I mean, was Atari supposed to take over manufacturing of the devices? Was it supposed to just be using Atari's distribution channels? What was the nature of that agreement that Sega wanted to sign with Atari?
My memory has just improved, and the name that you and I shouldn't have and I couldn't have forgotten was Dave Rosen. So Dave Rosen was...
Oh,
right.
You were dealing
Dave
directly
Rosen
with Dave
was
Rosen.
my immediate boss in theory, even though he was in Los Angeles and just did the Sega responsibilities part-time and did his own financial investing and real estate investing. He had an office in Century City. It was Dave Rosen that got me to Sega to be the first president of the U.S. division and, formally launch the Genesis. I had known Dave Rosen for a long time also, going back to the Mattel days. And he's a great guy. He was very successful. He was an old statesman of, electronic games from Japan. He after he was in the Korean War and was in Asia, I believe he spent time in Japan, living in Japan, and did a lot with the Pachinko business over there, and eventually founded with, I don't know if it was Nakayama or not, but founded Sega and then moved back to the States and became the head of Sega in the U.S. So I'm sorry I lost track of your last question.
Not a problem. No, it's a question of what was the proposed nature of the relationship between Sega and Atari for the distribution and sale of the Genesis. I mean, was it supposed to be manufacturing by Atari? Was it simply supposed to be an import business with a relabeling of the machines? What was the nature?
I forget whether the manufacturing was going to be done by Sega, but that would have been their sole responsibility, just doing the manufacturing. I guess if they wanted to do software development to play and, have a software division, with software playing under some arrangement on the Atari-owned Genesis machine, that would have been involvement. But they were willing to give up all rights to, the Genesis unit. I don't know whether it was a 5-year deal, a 10-year deal, a 20-year deal, but it was a licensing deal where Atari would pay an advance and a guarantee over time and a percentage royalty based on every piece of hardware shipped to Sega for the Genesis. I do not remember whether they were going to do the manufacturing or Atari was going to do the manufacturing.
Okay, but yeah, that would have definitely changed the nature of the beast
yes,
a little bit.
If Jack, had become committed to supporting a launch of a major new video game system with marketing and with development support, and historically he didn't have a track record for being willing to okay those expenditures. So it could have been a wonderful opportunity with Atari having a wonderful product, but having the same problems with retailers and developers that Jack was known for. If his attitude had changed and he said, okay, it'll be easier for Atari to be, a great video game company again, we'll do it with the product we're buying from Sega. It'll be Atari's Genesis. If he had a whole lobotomy and a different mindset, then it might have been great. If he retained the attitude that he was still a computer guy and Atari was going to be a computer company, and he was going to do business with retailers and developers in his traditional way, then it wouldn't have worked. So
yeah, and is that deal happening? I'm guessing in '88 at that point, or was that already
which deal? I'm sorry,
'89. The Sega.
When Sega decided, we were offered the product in probably 87 or 88. I joined Sega in '89 in the fall, if I'm not mistaken, which was right at the introduction of the Genesis, but prior to any kind of real introduction in terms of marketing support, full distribution, development, software availability, and all that. So, the offer must have been in early '88 to Atari.
Gotcha. So even before the Japanese launch of the console, which was was fall of '88.
It might have been roughly around the
Japanese
same time.
Launch. Yeah. Okay. Now, there's another acquisition of technology by Atari that happens around '88, '89, which was the Handy, which later became known as the Atari Lynx. Were you involved with that? With that hardware acquisition by Atari?
Now, was the Lynx the product that eventually ended up in the hands of Epix a few years after I left Epix? The irony was they got a state-of-the-art new handheld game system. That's what I also had been crusading the board to have Epix get a product like that or develop one, years before. The board acceded to the request. It was purchased, I think, buy Epics from Atari, but it was too late with too little. So, it's lots of times it's all about timing. So the Lynx, I think the Lynx was developed by Atari after I left Atari, and the Lynx, ironically, was sold by Atari to Epics, if I'm not mistaken.
The other way around. Epics developed it, and it gets purchased by Atari and released by Atari.
Okay.
Yeah. But and curiously enough, it was developed by basically the team that a part of the team that had made the Amiga over at Commodore, that was released by Commodore. So it was all a confusing mess. But okay, so you got disappointed with the electronic toy efforts being for naught with Jack Tramiel. He wasn't going to go for any of that. And does Sega ask you, does David Rosen ask you to come to Sega, or how does that transition take?
I had a stock option plan that ran over 4 or 5 years, where I vested a percentage of stock each year on the anniversary of my employment. So after 3.5 years at Atari, I had vested a lot of my stock option. The company was public. The stock had gone from 3 to 12, and I didn't sell at the right time, unlike Coleco, but I had vested a lot of stock, I think 75% of my allotment, and I had had enough of corporate life, of working at Atari, and basically doing the same thing that I'd done for many years. And I had never traveled a lot around the world, and I was very interested in traveling. So Sam Tramiel walked into my office after that 3.5 years, and it was, I guess, product planning time for the next year, whatever the next year was, 1988 perhaps. And he said, well, can you take me through your plans for the coming year? And I reached into my desk drawer where I had a baseball cap embroidered MVK, those are my initials, World Tour, 1988. So rather than answer Sam's question while he was sitting across from me, waiting for an answer, I put the hat on. And he said, what's the hat? What is this? And I said, Sam, these are my plans. I quit. I'm going around the world. And so I quit and went around the world for 3 or 4 months and did other things, taking it easy, spending more time with my children for several months. And my plan was to think about other business opportunities, other aspects, other fields of business that I'd always been interested in. Especially retailing was really hot. I loved what Ralph Lauren had done. I had other interests in other things not related to the video game industry or the toy or electronics industry. So I wanted to explore them after I had, taken my sabbatical trip or my long trip. So that's what I did. And I came back, and a few months later, when I was still considering doing other things, I got a call from Dave Rosen telling me that they had decided not to license the Sega hardware to anyone else. They were going to open a U.S. division, do it themselves, build up a capability, a software development capability. In other words, build a large game design department, build a real company that had business development, sales, marketing, finance, operations, IT, product design, packaging, blah, blah, blah. And would I want to, become the head of the U.S. division of Sega, the first head, basically, and formally take over the launch of Genesis and, build their company organizationally and go after Nintendo's 95% share of market. So that was an easy way out. I hadn't broken into any new businesses yet, and I was learning that despite the fact that someone might have an interest in doing something else, despite that they might functionally be well qualified to be a finance person or an accounting person or a marketing person or a manufacturing person, once you're branded for a particular industry, even though you know the functions that could apply to a lot of different products in that industry, once you're branded to being a toy guy or a grocery products guy or a computer person or a this or a that, it's pretty hard to just snap your fingers and move into a different industry at the level that you want to move into it. So I accepted the Avis versus Hertz challenge again in my career, which became a Sega versus Nintendo challenge, and accepted Dave Rosen's offer, met Nakayama for the first time, and set about building Sega as a company, building Genesis as a product, as a brand, and getting Genesis does what Nintendo don't, as the whole marketing positioning for us, being unable to get hot arcade licenses because Nintendo, with their 95% share, had a lock on all the Japanese arcade companies and an exclusive on their product. So it occurred to me, we need something exclusive that would be meaningful to the U.S. consumer to get them to jump over. And so we went after personality licenses, with Joe Montana being the first one. I gave Joe Montana a check for $1.2 million as an advance for 5 years to use him as the personality behind a football game that would allow us to compete with Madden at Electronic Arts. We got Tommy Lasorda for baseball. We got Pat Riley for basketball. We got, I forget Douglas's name, for 6 months. He was the boxing champion of the world before he got defeated, but that was okay because that rounded out our product line of sports personalities, and we didn't have to pay him much of an advance or royalty. So the fact that he only held the title for 6 months didn't make much difference. It allowed us to promote those personalities. We had Michael Jackson, promote those personalities under the banner Genesis does what Nintendo don't, which came to mean, which was our intent, that we had a 16-bit system. No one else did. That 16-bit system that Genesis could do in terms of technology, more and better graphics, animation, sound than the Nintendo 8-bit system. We had personalities exclusively that nobody else had. We played that up because we couldn't get the arcade titles. And we built a game design capability by hiring game design people that I knew to join Sega from within the U.S., getting independent development groups to do work on their own to develop games for Sega, for the Genesis. And we split up responsibilities with Japan. They were in charge of creating a character. They created Sonic the Hedgehog. That was under development for several years, starting with before I took over the Sega responsibilities for the U.S. And we needed a cartoon character to be the Donkey Kong or Pac-Man that Nintendo and Namco had. That became Sonic the Hedgehog. So the Japanese developed the cartoon animation games. We in the U.S. were the experts for sports and other things like driving and flying, and I think whatever genres they didn't want to do or weren't that qualified to do in Japan. So it was building a company organizationally, functionally, and marketing-wise, and making a product successful against someone that had 95% of the market. So our efforts paid off. Perhaps they didn't pay off till 6 months or a year after I left, but the whole basis and grounds for establishing Sega and Genesis started with all of us who were there in 1989 and built it and made it happen. There's one good story, I guess, that people like to hear that's little known, and that was after I convinced, against their will, the Japanese to let me write a check for $1.2 million for Joe Montana so we could get him. We beat out Nintendo, by the way. We didn't know we were competing with Howard Lincoln, who was the president of Nintendo, and Peter Main, who was the head of marketing. But we beat them out the first time they had gotten beaten out for a hot license. We beat them out for Montana, and that got Genesis launched for the first Christmas, with Joe Montana being the key piece of software that if you wanted it, you had to buy the Genesis system, just like we had done with Donkey Kong and ColecoVision. If you wanted Donkey Kong, which I discussed with you in the last interview, you had to buy in the first 6 months the new ColecoVision system. So that was a formula that was well known in the industry and that we used at Sega. Competitive advertising, that was the first time it had been done so directly with a Japanese company in the history of business. The Japanese have considered it or had considered it inappropriate culturally to do competitive direct marketing against an opponent. So I had to get Dave Rosen to convince Nakayama in Japan that that's what we needed to do for our battle against Nintendo. And finally, they approved culturally us doing Genesis Judgment Nintendo and doing the whole competitive stance against Nintendo. That all took place in the first year that Sega US existed. What also took place was we had farmed out the Genesis Joe Montana football game. We wanted it to come out in December in time for Christmas, along with the formal launch of the Genesis hardware. We found out that the independent development group that we were using, which actually was housed inside one of the other video game software companies. It was Bruce Davis's company, and it was, why am I blanking? Well, they had a team of experienced football development people who were developing the football game for us. We needed it quickly. We needed it to be good. It turned out that there were internal fights going on at Bruce Davis's company. The game was not as far along as we needed it to be. We were risking having the Genesis ready for introduction, but no hot game to present with it. So it occurred to me a fast way to get a good football game might be to call up Trip Hawkins, my old buddy, who was the founder, of course, and president of Electronic Arts and had John Madden football. So I picked up the phone, I called him, and I said, here's our problem. You can help me solve it, Trip. Do you happen to have a backup football game for your current John Madden that you would be willing to sell to us at Sega on a fair deal, a buyout or a royalty deal? That would bail us out, and we could have a football game close to or at the time we needed it for the introduction of Genesis. So the deal was yes. Electronic Arts finished that backup game, and little known fact, the backup game for John Madden became the Joe Montana football game that Sega introduced with Genesis. So what else did Trip get for it? He got a sweetheart deal, and on any software he did for Genesis, he paid, as I recall, no royalty to Sega, or a much reduced royalty that he would have had to have paid if he didn't have a sweetheart deal. So, are you familiar with that story, Carl?
I am familiar with it. I've actually heard Tripp tell it in interviews as well. But he also added an element about how EA had reverse engineered the Genesis, so they were threatening, as he would put it, or insinuating that they might publish without any kind
Correct.
of licensing.
He argued that he could do it without paying Sega anything. So he was either allowed to, I don't recall, he was either allowed to do it based on helping us out with the with the Montana football game, or he paid a much reduced rate. When I've heard him tell the story, he doesn't really get into the detail that I just got into with you about how that all came about. He talks about having a reduced royalty deal, but he doesn't talk about having given Sega a Joe Montana football game, which led to a compromise on Sega's position about the royalties for Electronic Arts.
Gotcha. Well, it also makes sense. I mean, you guys needed that game, and he had the game, so one hand washes the other, right?
He could have held out, but that would have, hurt Sega in making Genesis as successful as it became, because it's all based on how good the games are. So that would have been counterproductive for him, not to help us. But I was very grateful at the time that was a quick solution to a big problem, because the Japanese didn't quite understand a lot about how business was done internally in the U.S. between hardware companies and software publishers. So, there had to be compromise, give and take, and you scratch my back and I'll help scratch yours kind of mentality.
Cool. Now, when you're inheriting a Sega, or you came into a Sega that hadn't existed before. The previous Sega console, the Master System, had been distributed for the most part by Tonka. Then Sega, I believe, takes back the license in 88 or 89 and was distributing the Master System themselves and having to basically play second fiddle or fifth fiddle to the NES. When you had to come in and build up the marketing mechanism, how much of a marketing and distribution infrastructure did Sega already have when you arrived, and what were some of the challenges you faced building that up?
There was one marketing manager. There was a VP of sales. I don't remember whether Sega had used reps or their own sales force and their own regional and district sales managers. I think not. I think they used reps, and they had their own VP of sales who we kept when I came in. I was tempted to, bring in my own salespeople, but I wanted to be fair. I did hire some marketing people that I had worked with before, and the marketing person who was at Sega, who had been a J.C. Penney buyer, and was hired, I guess, out of that position by Sega several years before. And I should be remembering the names of all these people. Al Nielsen was the marketing manager. The sales VP was a guy named Dave Rhodes. So Al stayed with Sega. I think Dave Rhodes got replaced when I left Sega, and when Tom Kalinske, who I'd known from Mattel, replaced me and brought in a lot of his own people. I basically built the internal development staff from scratch and hired Ken Ballphaser, who had been a head of development at least 2 companies in the industry, and I knew well and respected. And Ken got the job of building the internal development group until he was replaced by a guy who Kolinsky brought in, who Kolinsky knew from some other life, as I recall. We used some development groups that I had used previously. The ad agency that came up with Genesis Does What Nintendo Don't, had been the agency that I guess Dave Rosen had hired, because he sort of took over that function in the old Sega. They came up with the competitive commercial and the slogan, but I think they were probably replaced after I left too. So I brought in some service groups, some people that I had worked with before, not as many as I had when I took over Epics, but, some functions. And we still had a relatively small staff compared to Nintendo and some of the other companies we were competing with. So that was the story there.
Now, when you came in, what was the reaction from retailers to the product? I mean, because not only is it a relatively unknown brand for retail. I mean, if you were an arcade goer, Sega was a known commodity, but for retailers, it was still a relative unknown. And did any of them fear reprisals or repercussions from Nintendo if they stocked
Good question.
Sega's?
We had to fight to get distribution because their response in some cases were, who needs Sega? We've got Nintendo. Nintendo's got 90%, 95% of the market. We've got plenty of Nintendo software. We're making good money from the software. We're making decent money on the hardware. Do we really need Sega? So we had to fight. We had to fight to get distribution. And what helped a lot was the competitive stance we took, getting the sports personalities, being willing as Sega to, cooperate with the retailers, contribute a lot to the co-op advertising, buy shelf space, in effect, on the promise that we were going to heavily advertise and promote. Look at the figures we were playing or we were paying to get as personalities. Look at the competitive commercials we made. Look at everything we're doing. Did that work with Toys R Us, with KB, with Target? Yes. Did it work with Walmart? No, because Walmart, if you didn't know, took a stance, which they still do, I think, in electronics and toys, that they're not going to take a big risk and make a big investment to promote a new brand or a new system. Wait till year 2 or 3. They were patient. They could wait till the product was successful nationally in other channels, and then they could then move in and give good distribution and support to that new brand. So we had to work like hell to get distribution with Walmart, who was and is a major factor. We didn't have to work that hard to get initial distribution from the KBs and the Targets and the Toys R Us's, who were more willing to give another brand a shot, especially since we were going to heavily promote and because we were a more powerful, higher price premium system. So there was a reason. If, there hadn't been a reason with the Mega Drive, which was just an 8-bit competitor to Nintendo's 8-bit or to ColecoVision. But, the fact that Genesis had a lot more power, was getting software support, slowly, but eventually against Nintendo. It was then a matter of time for how long it would take Nintendo gamers to appreciate the more powerful system, appreciate the exclusive software, at least on the sports side, and become a factor once Sonic the Hedgehog was finished, and Sega, after I left, had a competitor to the likes of Pac-Man and Donkey Kong, and character licensed software that was cartoon related. So it was slow, but it happened as we got support from all the retailers and as consumers began to appreciate the power of Genesis and the software library that Genesis put together. So the fruits of the labor happened in 90, 91, 92. I was no longer there. Tom Kalinske had come in, who was basically hired over me directly by Nakayama, who knew Tom from the toy days, and thought that we, the Michael Katz regime, should have done a faster job building the install base beyond 500,000 units, which was actually quite good because of our having to overcome the giant franchise and base that Nintendo had. So that's the story.
Now, did you have any involvement with Sega's European operations, or was that being handled outside from Japan
Correct.
At that point? Okay. And so you've got the Genesis out there. Now, there was another, and I'll put it in quotation marks, 16-bit system, the NEC's TurboGrafx 16, hitting the U.S. market at the same time as the Genesis. Did that show up in your calculations at all, or was it all Nintendo?
All Nintendo all the time. The TurboGrafx was good in terms of power and technically, but they didn't have a great software library. They didn't have the hot titles, and there was no need for a system from a company that the consumer was not that familiar with, and the retailer felt no need to support because Sega was filling the need for a 16-bit system, and the retailers in the U.S. were familiar with Sega as a company and appreciated the support that they were getting from Sega and the development support that Sega had generated through our efforts internally at Sega and through major third-party software companies.
Were your responsibilities at all involved with Sega's arcade operations at that point?
No, and never were by Sega US. That was all handled by Sega in Japan.
We touched on it briefly in our first interview that you actually testified at a very important lawsuit involving Nintendo's position in the market.
Correct. Atari and Sega jointly were plaintiffs against Nintendo being the defendant in federal court for monopolistic practices, meaning the lock that Nintendo had with various Japanese arcade game companies for hot properties that Nintendo and Sega argued, Atari and Sega argued were not available to Sega and Atari because of the relationship that Nintendo had directly, monopolistic, dedicated relationship with some of those arcade companies. And that was responsible to a large degree for Nintendo having generated a 95% share of market. Their relationship with those individual arcade companies.
As far as my understanding of it is, Atari was really the spearhead of that lawsuit, even though Sega had joined them. Was the decision to join it your decision, or was that already ongoing litigation at the time you joined Sega?
I assume ongoing, because I didn't have anything to do with getting Sega and Atari jointly to go after Nintendo. I suspect it was the legal departments of Atari and Nintendo, who decided to Nintendo, and it was Atari, Sega's legal departments who decided to go after Nintendo on a monopolistic practices, antitrust kind of suit.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you testified about at that trial?
Yeah. I testified, I think, about the marketing steps and marketing activities that were being taken to support Atari's brands in an attempt to gain share of market against Nintendo. So it was about what we had done to demonstrate that we did have a marketing effort, we did have advertising, we did have promotion that was aimed at the consumer to generate awareness and trial for Atari and for Sega. As I mentioned to you, as part of Nintendo's defense against the monopolistic practices argument, the argument of Nintendo in the court was that it was because Nintendo and Atari and maybe Sega were not spending at the levels necessary to gain more of a share of market, and that the commitment to marketing was so much less that it was that reason that had generated a large share of market for Nintendo, not the reason that they had access to software on a exclusive basis because of the relationships with the software suppliers, with the Namcos, with the Capcoms, with the Tatos, with the various arcade companies that were Japanese, not because of a captive relationship for the software and the games with them that was resulting in this 95% share of market. It was due to the lack of spending and commitment because of Jack Trammell's philosophy and attitude, that it was that reason that Nintendo was doing so much better, not because of the relationships and exclusives over the software. That was the argument of the defense.
And ultimately, that argument won the case. And the marketing campaign that you guys launched, not only, for the Genesis, not only does it have that confrontational element, but it was also very, very present at the time. What did it feel like for you as a marketer after having been restrained for so long at Atari with such a limited budget? What did that feel like to suddenly have a little bit more free reign at Sega?
It felt great. We were not restrained monetarily from doing or arguing that what we needed was a strong, well-supported marketing approach.
And was there anything that you wish you could have done, but from a marketing standpoint, anything you wish you could have done, but it didn't work out, or you didn't get the green light for it, or something? Was there any idea that was left on the table?
Well, everything revolved around our competitive marketing and advertising stance in terms of product and in terms of advertising and in terms of the whole Genesis does what Nintendo was supported the way we wanted it supported in terms of advertising, media dollars, promotion, things we wanted to do at the CES shows to drive that home, in terms of a PR, being on, not only reviewers who reviewed the product favorably, but, coverage we got journalistically for the competitiveness and for the whole product approach and positioning.
Okay. So all your dreams came true.
I didn't enjoy a lot of the approval process that had to come from Japan. I didn't enjoy their not understanding the nature of the market in the U.S. and how much time and effort it would take to convert those Nintendo players to Sega players. I think there was a lack of appreciation by Japan, not by Dave Rosen, but by Japan, that you just don't snap your fingers and sell 1 million units in year one of the new product when you're going against a competitor that has a 95% share and that has a lock on a lot of hot software titles and has established themselves over, a 5-year period as being the leader in the games industry, especially in the U.S. So I didn't appreciate their lack of understanding of the kind of work and effort it took and time it took to gain share of market and to establish Sega. And I assume they learned it when Sega and the efforts we had made got a 35 to 40% share of market in year 2 and 3 and 4 of the introduction of the Genesis. So I had a different frustration, but as far as doing the marketing the way I wanted to do it, with the right kind of financial support behind the marketing and behind the building the organization to the extent that we built it in that 1.5-year period, I appreciated all of that.
One more question. The marketing obviously was appealing to the Nintendo players and the existing console players, and I know you have no true love for the computer game market in that sense, but was there any conscious effort to try to convert computer gamers over to the Genesis, over to console?
Not by me, and not when I was there. So we didn't aim at them and say, hey, computer gamer, you should now come over to video game systems because they have more power and give you the kind of speed, picture, animation, sound that you're used to on the computer side. We never took that approach. We just went after the established base because it was such a large and strong base of people who are already gamers who would naturally be looking for the next best game, which became Montana or became the Hedgehog or became whatever, and or were looking for a faster system and a better system that gave them a better gaming experience. So our competitive stance was against Nintendo and the installed game base, not intentionally against computer gamers who weren't playing video games at all.
Yeah, you've already mentioned it. You end up getting replaced because the Japanese management wasn't satisfied with the speed with which the systems were selling, even though 500,000 units in the first year is not bad at all. Before you get to that replacement, was there... the Genesis, or as it was known there, the Mega Drive, never really takes off as far as market share was concerned in Japan itself. Was there any, I don't want to say finger pointing, but was that ever a topic of discussion between the branches of the company?
No, it was not. To show the anxiety that Sega Japan was feeling toward distribution and sales in the first 12 months, when Walmart took the position that they were going to wait till year 2, which is their, as I mentioned, their normal strategy with new products, to see if they wanted to take on a product nationally. When Japan wasn't willing to accept that, they decided, they being a guy named Shinobu Toyota, who was in his late 20s, who was Japanese, who had worked for Sega, who lived in Texas full-time, but commuted 5 days a week to San Francisco to be the go-between between the Japanese in Japan and Sega in the U.S. So he was, as many Japanese companies have, if you want to be rude about it, I could say the Japanese spy, who between the hours of 7 o'clock at night and 9 o'clock every night would have confidential telephone calls back to his contact in Japan, talking about exactly what in their minds was going on in the U.S. division. So Shinobu got involved in a discussion with the people in Japan about how they could accelerate Walmart's action in taking distribution on the Genesis immediately. And somebody had the bright idea to open a a Genesis-only retail store in the small town of Bentonville, Arkansas, which, as you probably know, is where Walmart's headquarters is. And basically sell only Genesis product out of that store as a means of influencing the buyer and the merchandise manager at Walmart headquarters 50 yards up the block into carrying Genesis. Why? Because his employees would put pressure on him to have the product in all the Walmart stores.
What?
Or
okay.
That was the theory. Also to include maybe printing up cushions for the University of Arkansas or whatever key football college is there. Print up cups for Coke. Print up cushions to put on the seats in the football stadium, all with the Genesis logo and promotion on it. So the theory was, do anything to get the product in the nose of key Walmart people and somehow influence them to take on the product. So those kinds of discussions, I guess, were going on between 7 o'clock at night and 9 or 10 o'clock at night from Shinobu to his counterpart in Sega Japan, in their efforts to, break into the policies, merchandising policies of Walmart on the behalf of Genesis. So, isn't that interesting?
That is. I mean, I guess it goes towards this fundamental idea that marketing has to be tailored to the market. And if you try to go in someplace where you don't understand what the culture is or what the mechanics are, and you're not willing to work within those confines, you're going to start making some very bad mistakes, I guess. And these guys just did not want to believe that they were going to have to wait for that one outlet.
Or I had already told you about Yakumandai, but I don't know if you remembered it. I learned one phrase in Japanese, which is Yakumandai, my pronunciation's right, which is 1 million units in Japan. And what I was supposed to say to myself every morning when I woke up was Yakumandai, because the target for Nakayama and the Japanese was that we sell 1 million units in the first 12 months. And I like to say I and we only sold half a yuck. So it was time for Michael Katz to leave. So they had also generated that target in their mind. And if that target wasn't reached, then the company was not successful and wasn't doing their job.
Oh, jeez.
I used to write reports once a month that outlined our progress and the problems and opportunities. And do I know whether that report was ever read? It was about 10 pages and took a lot of time. I think I never got feedback once or reference once to the report and any of the text that accompanied explanations, opportunities, risks, or anything like that. So,
yeah.
Anyhow.
Oh, so what happened at the end when did they just say sorry, you're dismissed, or was there a transition period while you were waiting for Kaczynski to come in, or how did that all work?
He was unemployed at the time, so as I recall, he came right in, and I guess I left. And Dave Rosen claimed, by way of apology to me, that he had thought this, and it was all about Nakayama knowing Tom from Tom's days at Mattel. And I think Tom spent a short time at Matchbox. Was it Matchbox or Tonka? I'm not sure which. And he ran into Nakayama at a toy show or toy fair in Japan, apparently. And so that renewed their acquaintance or friendship. And Nakayama decided that, we weren't moving fast enough. I didn't get a great explanation, and I never got an apology, and I never got a recognition that any of us had really, from anyone at Sega, other than Dave Rosen, that any of us had really, built the base for what happened in the next 4 or 5 years and the phenomenal, turnaround in market share and everything else. But that's the way it goes in business sometimes. And, you look in the mirror every morning, ask yourself if you're doing as great a teaching job as you want to, or whatever you're doing professionally. And, to thine own self be true. If you're happy and doing what you think is right and doing the best, that's what counts. But, politically, lots of times you've got to be willing to play the game. And I think I went to Japan only once or twice in 18 months. And I guess I should have been over there if I wanted to, which I didn't. Communicating, shining the shoes of the bosses over there. But, that had nothing to do with meeting the goals. So I've never played the game. political game, and I value people who never have. So that's the story.
Very cool, and probably not the worst philosophy to live by. So, what have you been doing since your time at Sega?
About, I don't know how much time after I left Sega, within the year, I had a thought that I could stay somewhat connected with the video game business without being in it and working for a corporation or a big organization. I could be in it on my own as the first ever retained executive search firm that found people for client companies just for the video game industry. So I started an executive search firm, retained, which means you get retained assignments. They're exclusively for, the search person, and you write a contract, you get an assignment or assignments from a company, and lots of times the search firms like Korn Ferry and Heidrick & Struggles get paid a giant fee, like a third of someone's salary, plus a percentage of bonuses, for placing someone or not placing someone. They don't get paid for success. They just get paid for their time. So I never really thought much of search people when I was running companies or working at companies, because I thought if you're in small enough industry, you would know most of the people, and you could just get on the phone and call people you knew that you wanted to hire from other companies. So what's the big deal? It's all about relationships and knowing who you want, or finding out from people you know who the best person for a job, is or are. So I was in that position because I'd just been at 5 companies in the industry, and I knew the guys who ran the companies who I could get as clients, and I knew everyone who worked in the industry who I could get as candidates for the positions that the clients wanted me to fill. So I started Michael Katz and Associates. There were no associates most of the time over the 5 or 6 years, but it was extremely easy to build up a client base of 50 companies, which I did at the height, and I placed 200 executive-type people, not programmers, designers, artists, but producers, executive producers, heads of sales, business development, marketing, those kind of functional areas. And I only charged for performance. So I charged for completing the search and tried to do the searches more quickly and efficiently than any of the other search firms in the industry, not the video game search firms, because I was the first one. So I got clients like Microsoft. Microsoft was my first client for 6 positions, I think, all to go into what was called the Games Group at that point. There was no Xbox division. It's a games group run by a guy named Tony Garcia, who was about 30. And at age 18, we had given a job as a game tester at Epix to Tony. That got him into the video game business. That got he and I acquainted. And so when I decided to do this and called about 10 people who ran companies, including Tony at Microsoft, and asked if it was a good idea to be a specialized guy doing this in our industry, they all were very positive. And Tony actually gave me an assignment for 3 product managers, marketing positions, and 3 producers. So I placed 6 people within about 60 days at Microsoft in the games group. And that was my first client company. And then from there, my client list grew to companies, all kinds of companies. Lucas, DreamWorks briefly had a a games division. I went to Europe with some of their administrative people and interviewed for 3 days the best executive producers in the game companies in Europe. We interviewed in London at a hotel, and we hired 3 executive producers to start up the Dreamsworks development group. So that was gratifying. And Logitech was a client of mine. Acclaim Entertainment was a client of mine. Electronic Arts was a client of mine. J2 Interactive. So I ended up having 50 clients, placing 200 people. And my whole spiel was I worked for results. And so I would get an advance of some sort against my fee, which was, I think, generally 25% of first-year salary versus 33% that the big headhunting firms charged. And I would not charge if I didn't complete the placement. And I think I got about 95% a completion rate, which is unheard of in the times that I did that. So that kept me somewhat connected with the video game space and people in it. It was easy. It was gratifying from a money sense, but I don't think headhunting as a profession is at all suited to me because, it didn't have any of the stuff that I like to do, which is business related, not staffing related. But it was a good temporary thing, something good to do on my own. I had my own hours. I worked out of a home office. So I did that for 6 or 7 years, and it was great. And I had plenty of free time when I wanted it. And since then, I've done ventures that I won't get into today because I'm getting tired, but ventures as diverse as getting into the artisan bread business in a very interesting way after using a recipe from Club Med for something called white chocolate bread, and getting into a partnership with a baker in Sonoma was in charge of the U.S. baking team that beat the French for the first time the Americans ever beat the French. And you're in Europe, so you probably know the pronunciation. But the coup de main de la boulangerie, whatever the baking contest is that's held every either 3 or 4 years in France in different categories. I partnered with the first American who had a team that beat the French for the first time. And we actually developed a bread line that we took around and showed to Pillsbury and General Mills and, pitched to Safeway and a lot of other places. And that's a whole story in itself. And I didn't do it because it turned out that distribution is the problem with fresh bread products. So you've got to be able to make money by having lots of trucks that take fresh bread out every day to your retail customers or restaurants or hotels. And in most cases, you have to give the customers their money back for any of the loaves of bread or units that don't sell. In the case of the products we had, products were so liked by the people we're selling to or going to sell to that they said that they would eat any leftovers at the end of the day. They just loved what we had to offer. But as a business model, we couldn't make any business. We couldn't make volume. And we considered, selling the recipes and making it a frozen product that would go into General Mills line or Pillsbury's line. Anyhow, that's the story itself. Then I got into the 1 gram gold business for a while after being in India and seeing that one guy had 60 stores selling beautiful 1 gram gold jewelry, which were models of all the famous designs that women wear in India of the gold jewelry that's 24, 28 karat. But this guy was using a base like his father had used of copper and coating it with gold, 28 karat gold coating. So it looked and felt like the real 24-karat pure gold. And very successful in India. We brought it to the States, presented it to Bergdorf Goodman, Bloomingdale's, Macy's. There were various responses. Most of them were extremely positive. But in this case, it was perceived as being too ethnic and not broad-based in terms of its appeal. So there were other ventures like that I've done, as well as doing some consulting for companies in the video game or consumer product space, and being a grandfather, and not missing the grind of a large company, but missing the action of coming up with new products in the in the games category. So that turns me on. So when I'm helping guys like the Block Party people, that's interesting and fun. It gets me back in the action a little, seeing some people I know and thinking about how to market and promote and sell new products again. So for 20 years, you could say I'm 90% retired. And, I also looked into going into the cruise business and setting up a ambassador program for Celebrity, which is a division of Royal Caribbean. So I had conversations with them about that, and that was to do sort of a Tupperware, Mary Kay kind of go visit people in their living rooms, have them have all their friends over who either had never cruised at all, who were all over 60, or who had cruised but never on Royal Caribbean, and I would build up a whole cadre of ambassadors for different parts of the world who would get new business for Royal Caribbean, the line, or Celebrity, which is under Royal Caribbean, and get rewarded for the new cruisers that got signed up, because I love the concept of cruising. Boy, has it suffered in the last 2 months. But I love it. And so that was, in each of those cases, I was taking a product that I personally loved and trying to commercialize it, or, do something with it in a big way. So I've got to love the product or the service. And I made a pitch to Royal Caribbean, and they loved it, and they pointed out to me that they hadn't had any problem filling their ships, because every line has to fill their ship just to break even. But where they make their money is the drinks, the gambling, and the excursions that are sponsored by the ship. That's the profit center, those three areas. And it occurred to me that I might not be too great if I set up the ambassador program, because I'm a value traveler and a value shopper. And what I love about cruising is you can get so much for relatively little money. And if I made that the pitch on the ambassador program, I don't think the cruise line would have liked the fact that I was pitching getting away with not doing much excursions, gambling, or drinking, and just having the lowest overall bill, because my whole shtick in cruising is, why go on a line like Regent or what are the other ones, Crystal or Regent or Seabourn, which charge 3 or 4 times as much as some of the Royal Caribbean or other Carnival lines, because the service is great on all of them. The cabin's the same size on all of them. The ports you go to are the same. So who wants to pay 3 times more just to have maybe a personal butler shine your shoes? So that's what impresses me. I think that cruising is an equalizer. 40 years ago, it used to be, the Gatsbys and the Rockefellers and, everybody, all the world's most famous and wealthy people taking the Queen Elizabeth, from New York to England. But now it's just an inexpensive, wonderful vacation that everyone can take advantage of. And, it doesn't matter much whether you have a cabin with a window or a balcony. Who cares? Everyone else gets exactly the same kind of service. So that's what I love about cruising. It's an adventure that takes you to a different place every day on the cruises that I like. So I fooled around with that for a while. So if I was much younger, I should have expanded my executive search firm to a giant 100-person firm with all kinds of capabilities of people going after game designers in one case or developers, divisionalize it and become, over the last 20 years, the firm for digital entertainment in terms of staffing people. But I didn't love the staffing business, and I got older and didn't feel like doing that and managing people or starting a company. So that's my story.
And it was one hell of a story. So
when I see friends who are still at companies and they're in their 60s, let's say, not too many are in their 70s, I admire them for still working 24/7 or at least 8 to 10 hours a day in an industry that they've been in for a long time. But I when I'm missing it, I overlook the bullshit, the politics, the routine, the frustrations you have in any corporate environment. I overlook that and I say, gee, look at that guy or girl. They've hung in there. They've, continued to have great experiences and be involved in great successes, maybe made a lot of money, maybe not. But I overlook whether they have a smile on their face every morning when they're going to the same job at the same company year after year doing the same thing. So that's the trade-off.
You can't have it all.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I think that's it, Carl. I was a lot less. I think I'm sorry. What's the right word? I didn't quite have the energy and enthusiasm today. Nothing having to do with you or the subject matter. I just didn't. Maybe because of the world, or maybe because I was hungry. So I hope you can make something. I hope you can make something good out of it.
Hey, I can. Mike, this was amazing. Trust me, I was actually looking forward to this half more than the first half. Alone, just hearing about your time at Atari, that was really the kicker, because I knew there was a lot going on there behind the scenes at that in that period, and that was everything was interesting, but that alone was more than spectacular. And don't worry, you've got, if this is a down day for you, you're doing okay. Trust me.
Well, I've got an anecdote for you that I forgot. It's too late to include, but you'll get a chuckle out of it. When I told you about the Greenbergs at Coleco, the two brothers, one was an engineer by background and much more conservative, and he loved the pool products and things like that. He didn't like at all the electronics, but he was extremely thrifty. And when people said, how could you possibly get along with Jack Tramiel, I often say that, well, I worked 4 years for Arnold and Leonard Greenberg. And if they knew Arnold and Leonard, they knew what that meant. And so one characteristic of Leonard that was somewhat similar to Jack Tramiel's, by the way, Jack Tramiel, as you might or might not know, was a Holocaust survivor. Yeah. And his commitment to Israel and Judaism went so far as not allowing, which is understandable, any of his kids to ever buy German vehicles. German vehicles. So they always had to have either Italian, hence Gary had the Ferrari shop that he had, and the others had to have Jaguars. So they had a lot of Jaguars during that time, but they could not have BMWs or Mercedes or whatever brand it would be. But the Leonard Greenberg story is the town that I was trying to remember that was the carpet bastion, that we discussed, and then got converted into the electronics factory. I forget the name of the town, but whatever the town was, for anyone traveling to that facility from Hartford, Connecticut, it was about 100 miles away. you would have to pick up a hand-drawn map drawn by Leonard, which identified the roads that you would take to avoid any tolls between Connecticut and the plant. I'm serious, in the plant in New York State. And also it included the only accepted restaurants, and they included only Denny's and McDonald's, the only included restaurants in that route that would serve you a meal for under $3 or $4, which you could be compensated for.
Oh my goodness!
And when Coleco had that amazing year with Cabbage Patch and ColecoVision and everything, at the end of Toy Fair, which is in New York in the Toy Building, and each company can join a club, or used to be able to join a club in the Toy Building, and it was like sort of like a men's club. It had its own restaurant, and so if you were a member, your company was, you or a few of the employees could go to the restaurant and have a nice white tablecloth lunch, of Cobb salad or burgers or fish or something. So Leonard was known for being cheap and not being that social. But on the last day of Toy Fair, when we had that great Toy Fair, he walked down the hall and he stopped at my office and he stopped at the office of, I think, the two sales directors. And he said, "Come on, you guys, we're going to lunch." And first we were also shocked that he was inviting anyone to lunch. So we all said yes. And we took the elevator down to the floor that had the restaurant on it. And it was like a hotel's restaurant or a club restaurant. And the waiter came around and said, and there were four of us, I guess. The waiter said, "Okay, Mr. Greenberg, how are you? How's everything?" He said, "Great, great." He said, "I'm taking the guys out." And he said, "Okay, Mr. Greenberg, what'll it be?" And, he said, "Well, I guess it'll be 2 Cobb salads." And 2 Cobb salads. And so the waiter went to the next person and said, "What will you have?" And Leonard said, No. 2 Cobb salads. We want 2 Cobb salads. And the sales guy said to Leonard, "That's only a half a salad per person." And Leonard said, "Yeah, that's right." And the sales guy said, "Leonard, don't you think that after working 10 days at Toy Fair, about 20 hours a day, having a great Toy Fair, we might be able to up that?" And Leonard said, "Okay, just in this case," he said to the waiter, "make it 4 Cobb salads."
Oh my goodness.
That's true. I was there. That's true.
Okay, I may have to add that at the end of the interview as a bonus. That story's too good. Okay. I just looked at the clock. It's 4:01.
Time for you to get to bed.
Here, one sec. I just got to record a quick little closer.
Okay.
Well, hey, that's going to conclude our journey through your extremely interesting career. Any final words for our listeners?
Think carefully about what you want to do in life and try to make the right decisions. Do some planning and clearly go after what you want to go after, and realize that in life sometimes it's not how good you are, it's who you know. So if you have any good contacts, use them to get jobs or do things in areas that you have a personal interest. But by all means, be true to yourself.
Excellent words to live by. Mike, thank you so very, very much for an amazing conversation. I've loved it.